So as we concluded in the previous video, we have $8,554,000 in costs associated with the units that we completed in this department. Now, what journal entry do we make? Well, that depends. In the first example, let's just assume that the whole process is completed in this department. And so once we completed these units, we're moving them out of WIP and into finished goods under the assumption they're ready to be sold to the customer. That being the case, the journal entry we're going to make is to debit finished goods and credit work in process for the $8,554,000 that we allocated to the completed goods. Now, it's possible that that's not the case. It's also possible that there are multiple departments that these units have to flow through in order to be ready to sell. And this department may just be the first of several. In that case, what we would do is we would credit WIP for this department, let's call it Department 1, but instead of debiting finished goods, we're going to debit WIP for the next department that the units have to process through. And so we would debit WIP Department 2. If that's the last department, then when we're finished in Department 2, we'll move them out of WIP into finished goods. It's possible that there may be 3 or 4 departments, in which case we would have 3 or 4 different WIP accounts. So what I want to do next is look at an example of this Department 2 and how do we account for the goods in that department. So let's look at example 2. The process is very similar. The only difference is you will notice that in addition to direct materials and conversion costs, we have transferred in costs. Those are the costs that are transferred into this department, let's call it Department 2, from Department 1. So at the beginning of October, there were 5,500 units sitting in WIP for Department 2. These units had both transferred in cost of $2,931,000. These would have been the costs transferred in from Department 1, 0 material costs at this point, and conversion costs of $499,790. Now, what we're assuming in here is that all materials are added at the end of the period, at the end of the process. So in Department 1, you'll remember we assumed materials were added at the beginning. Here we're assuming they're added at the end, which is why beginning inventory has no material costs associated with them. Then you'll notice we've got 26,000 units transferred in during October. Those are the units that were transferred out from Department 1. In Department 2, we have 29,800 units that we actually completed, leaving us with 1,700 units in WIP in Department 2 at the end of October. So during October, we added costs to these units. Transferred in costs are $8,554,000. That number may look familiar. Those are the costs that were moved into Department 2 from Department 1 associated with these 26,000 units. We did incur $10,877,000 in direct materials and $4,696,260 in additional conversion costs. Again, we have the degree of completion for beginning WIP. Remember from the conversation in the previous example, since we're using weighted average, we don't really need that information, but I've included it just for grins. Degree of completion ending WIP. Transferred in costs are 100%. Well, that makes perfect sense. Everything's been transferred in. 0% for direct materials. This is based on the assumption that materials are added at the very end of the process in Department 2. Therefore, if they're sitting in WIP at the end of October, they're not completed. Nothing in the way of materials has been added. And then conversion costs of 45% complete. Again, Similarly to the previous example, we will use this information to calculate equivalent units, which is what we're going to do next. WIP on October 1 was 5,500. We transferred in 26,000 units. That all came from above. That leaves us with 31,500 units to account for. Now, as indicated in the data, we completed and transferred out 29,800 units. Remember, if we've completed something, the equivalent units and the physical units are equal. So for all transferred in materials and conversion costs, we have 29,800 in equivalent units. With regard to WIP, we had 1,700 units at 10/31. Again, transferred in or 100% complete. Everything's come in from the previous department. So equivalent units and physical units are the same. Notice 0 equivalent units as it relates to materials because they're added at the end of the process. There are no equivalent units for materials. And then conversion costs, we have 765, and that is the 45% completion times the 1,700 units. Then we will just add those together. Our transferred in, we have 31,500 equivalent units, 29,800 for materials, and then 30,565 for conversion costs. Then we're just going to go through the same process we did in the previous example. Again, the only difference is we now have a third type of cost. So we will take the costs from the data that was provided, that were provided, and we have 2,931,000 and transferred in, 8,554,000 added for a grand total of 11,485,000. There were no material costs related to beginning WIP. We added 10,877,000 for a total of 10,877,000. Conversion costs associated with beginning WIP, 499,790, plus those costs that were added during October, gives us a total of 5,196,050. Then, just like we did in the previous example, we will take the total cost for each category, divide it by the equivalent units for each category, and come up with a cost per equivalent unit. And you can see those there for each of the 3 categories of costs. Then we will allocate those cost per equivalent units to come up with the costs that are transferred out versus those that remain in the department associated with ending WIP. And we do that by taking the cost per equivalent unit times the equivalent units for each category. So completed and transferred out, the transferred in costs will be the 364.6 times the 29,800 equivalent units completed and transferred. For materials, it will be the 365 times that same 29,800. For conversion, it will be the 170 times the 29,800. Then for WIP, we will do exactly the same thing, the 364.6 times the 1,700 equivalent units for transferred in. Again, there are 0 equivalent units for materials, so there will be no material costs associated with ending WIP. And then the cost per equivalent for conversion costs, the 170 times the 765 units. Then we total each of those up, and we identify 26,808,175 associated with completed and transferred out, 749,875 associated with ending WIP. And then just as we did in the previous example, we make sure that this total, the total of those 2 numbers, equals the total that we needed to account for, and it does. So now, let's assume Department 2 was indeed the last department that needed to do anything with these goods, we would debit finished goods for the 26,808,175, and we would credit WIP Department 2 for the same. And then, of course, the 749,875 would remain in WIP for Department 2 to open up November